Welcome everybody to this fantastic joint Transportation Research Forum event between the Twin Cities and Chicago chapters of TRF. We have an exciting program today. We're going to learn a little bit about recent developments with the additional service on the Chicago Twin Cities corridor and maybe a couple of other updates on passenger rail service in the Midwest. Before we get started here with the program, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Eric Kempel. I'm a transport policy advisor at DePaul, and I also run my own consulting firm, Kempel International Transportation Consulting. I would also like to introduce Frank Duma. Frank, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thank you, Eric. I'm Frank Dauma. I'm a researcher at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs, associated also with the university's Center for Transportation Studies, and have been leading the Twin Cities chapter of the Transportation Research Forum for the last few years. Very, very pleased that the Chicago chapter reached out and invited us to be a co-sponsor of today's session. And we've done other sessions on a wide variety of topics, ranging from freight to automated vehicles to today's session on passenger rail. If folks from the Twin Cities enjoy this and would like to become part of the group and get onto our mailing list, they can certainly feel free to let me know, and I can work with Crystal to arrange distributing contact information if that's not immediately available.
Great. Thank you very much, Frank. And I would certainly echo that for the folks here in Chicago. If you're not a member of TRF, please let us know, reach out, and we can get you signed up. So the agenda today, we're going to start with our program for about the first 20 to 25 minutes. After that time, Frank and myself will provide a little bit of commentary on what we've heard, and then we'll turn it over to audience Q&A. And the way the Q&A will work, right now, the chat box is disabled. But after we complete the first part of the program, our audience can put questions into the chat box, and then some combination of Frank or myself will read off some of those questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. I know we've got a pretty big group here with us today, so I'm sure we won't be able to get to all of those questions. So let's move right along into why you're all here, which is to hear our speakers for today. Dick Rogers is the Business Planning and Analysis Manager at Amtrak, working out of Chicago Union Station. He has a very long history working in the railroad industry and can tell you everything you've ever wanted to know about the intricacies of Chicago politics. Our other speaker with us today is Derrick James. You probably know him as the face and voice of Amtrak if you've gone to anything where Amtrak was present, certainly here in the Midwest. He is the Senior Manager, Government Affairs, State and Local Legislative Relations at Amtrak, also based out of Chicago. And so with that, I am going to turn the floor over to these two gentlemen, Derrick and Dick. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here. Again, I'm joined by my colleague, Dick Rogers. He and I work together very closely on the project that we're going to talk about today. All right, well, the project that Dick and I have been working on, and the reason for us being here today, is the what we call TCMC, or the Chicago to Twin Cities project. We have been in partnership for several years with the states of Minnesota and the state of Wisconsin and the state of Illinois on increasing service in this particular corridor. We've had a long-standing relationship with the Wisconsin Department of Transportation on a portion of the corridor, specifically the Chicago to Milwaukee portion of the corridor. Many of you may know this. The presentation that I'm providing to you today, one of the things that I've been engaged with the communities and along the route is to gain political support for the expansion of service along this particular corridor. Where we stand right now, the federal government has been, in addition to providing Amtrak with an annual appropriation, we also provide, the federal government has several grant programs with which the states can apply for to invest in the capital infrastructure that's needed to make upgrades and expand and improve passenger rail. The states of Illinois and Wisconsin have been very aggressive in terms of going after those dollars for increases in service and improvements to the existing Chicago to Hiawatha corridor, which many of you may know is a multi-frequency corridor between Chicago and Milwaukee with 7 round trips a day. And the states of Illinois and Wisconsin have been working in partnership with the federal government and the host railroad to increase those services to 10 round trips a day, a project somewhere in the neighborhood of ultimately $300 million. And we've made some significant progress in terms of receiving grants to make some of those improvements along the right-of-way. As far as with the TCMC service, this is a sort of a newer grant recipient. I'll get into that, but just wanted to, in case for those who may not be familiar with Amtrak, I brief the legislators and sort of give them a primer on Amtrak, since Amtrak is not as much of a presence in the state of Minnesota. I inform them of our quasi-public role, our creation in 1970, sort of the basics of the route network, including where we go, how we receive funding, how we've been doing in terms of our performance over the past decade and a half in terms of growing ridership. Notwithstanding the pandemic, which has hurt all of commercial transportation, in fiscal year 2019, I remind them that Amtrak was able to break a ridership record carrying more than 32 million customers, and that support, that ridership and those improvements that we've been making have been because of bipartisan support from Congress. Because of Amtrak's nature of the service that we've been providing along both urban corridors in parts of the country as well as across much of rural America, has really given us an intro into both aisles, if you will, of the Congress. And they have shown that in terms of the financial support that they have provided to us. I say that because in Minnesota, support for transit and passenger rail, unfortunately, is not bipartisan in nature, and I try to show an example of Amtrak nationally, how we've moved beyond that, and that success has been borne out with improvements in ridership. I indicate the level of investment that we've been making across the system, and made possible by the reduction in the operating loss. Again, if not for the pandemic, Amtrak was projecting fiscal year 20 to be the first year where we would not need to use any federal dollars to support the operations of the network. Again, supported by robust capital investments, which transit needs and which we will still need, and the Congress has been willing to provide that. I indicate to the legislators that Amtrak, even though the state of Minnesota has not been a partner with Amtrak from a financial perspective for the types of services that we run, say between Chicago and Milwaukee, or Chicago and Detroit, or on certain California corridors, or in North Carolina, I indicate that the taxpayer investment in Amtrak is worthwhile and does generate investment and economic activity within the state of Minnesota. In fiscal year 19, Amtrak spent $71 million in procurement with companies within the state of Minnesota. Some of the big firms, one of the biggest is Loram, which is a rail equipment manufacturer in Hamel, Minnesota. And I list some of the other firms around the state that have been vendors of Amtrak. I also indicate that we've been making investments in the passenger rail network within the state of Minnesota, especially with regard to investments in the physical stations themselves. Red Wing is a rural station south of the Twin Cities. Winona, we are preparing to invest significant dollars in platform upgrades On the right there, you'll note La Crosse. La Crosse, yes, correct, is not in the state of Minnesota. It is in Wisconsin, but it's right on the border. Quite the catchment area within Minnesota, including many folks from Rochester who are going to and from Rochester will use the La Crosse station, where we have interline bus service with a private charter operator to connect Rochester folks with the Amtrak network. I provide examples of rail network growth that's been happening around the U.S. In partnership with other states, that other states have been very aggressive at going after the federal dollars that are made available through programs like the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement Grant Program, or the Restoration and Enhancement Grants. Here is an example of public officials doing at a ribbon cutting for new passenger rail service. I talk about states like North Carolina, a southern state that is moving aggressively to expand their rail service. Virginia, with new and expanded service to Roanoke and Norfolk. I also talk about expansion that we're working on with other states. Dallas-Fort Worth to Oklahoma City and up to Kansas City in partnership with Kansas and Oklahoma. I again highlight the Hiawathas, which is right next door, and the improvements that we've been making on other corridors in the Midwest in partnership with those states. I remind them that what we're asking, the partnership we're seeking of Minnesota is not something new, but it's something that we do with 18 other states, that it's a partnership to add mobility and increase the access to communities, both large and small, within states across the U.S. on the Amtrak network. Again, I remind them that the federal dollars are out there for them to access, that other states have been successful at doing so, and I remind them that Amtrak, the improvements that we've been making in our operating performance, again, increasing ridership and reducing our operating subsidy, has resulted in a lot more credibility that we have with the funders on Capitol Hill, including in this pandemic period where we were successful in seeking CARES Act funding both last summer and then in the recently passed Omnibus Appropriations Bill in December, additional funds to keep the system afloat until the economy returns and then ridership returns. I highlight that Minnesota is part of a consortium of states in the Midwest that has been working to advance passenger rail to improve the competitiveness of the region. Here on the right is a working map from the Federal Railroad Administration as part of their Connect program that's looking at and analyzing the corridors where it makes sense to invest in passenger rail, and conceivably that the federal government is willing to be a partner, as they have been on several of these corridors. And highlighted there in purple is the Chicago-Milwaukee Twin Cities route. It is considered one of the top corridors in the Midwest for potential passenger rail service from a demand perspective, that there are just the population centers along the corridor, the amount of traffic that's moving back and forth. Passenger rail could be extremely successful. And so the federal government and Amtrak is really looking to the state to partner with us to bring this corridor into fruition. Again, to affirm to those who, to give them an understanding of where we think passenger rail is going in the United States, that growth in corridors connecting metropolitan areas of 200 to 400 miles, that's really where it's at. That's the sweet spot for passenger rail, where we can provide the mobility options, where we can literally be the third leg of a stool, including highways and air, to increase mobility and, again, increase the economic competitiveness of American regions. I highlight, how Amtrak service is not evenly distributed across the United States, that passenger rail doesn't presently play an outsized role in the state of Minnesota, not because there aren't the customers there, but it's because the service is not there. And I talk about how Amtrak, how our plan is for growth in the large metro areas across the U.S., highlighted by the green circled areas where lots of growth is happening in the South, and the level of service that we provide, or the number of riders, is really a reflection of the amount of service that's provided. So yes, the Northeast Corridor has lots of Amtrak riders, but that's because we provide lots of service. And as that we've shown in the state of California, where over my tenure at Amtrak, we've really grown the ridership, the service levels out there, that the public has responded. I like to remind folks that on any day on Amtrak, 1 out of 5 Amtrak customers is on a passenger train in the state of California, a state that years ago was considered so highway-centric that travelers would not be interested in passenger rail. But with the service levels that we're providing, they have responded to it. I highlight the Hiawatha service, again, reminding them that what we're really looking at here is an extension of a very successful corridor in the Midwest, one that has a very high on-time performance, has great acceptance by the business community. We work closely with the business community on how we tailor the services. Businesses have made locational decisions in this corridor because of the presence of these trains. And we have received great support, letters of support for grant applications to the federal government for expansion. And again, I remind the Minnesota legislators that what we're looking to do is extending one of these Hiawatha trains up through the state of Minnesota, up through Wisconsin and to Minnesota, to start to replicate that model of success for the communities of Columbus, Wisconsin Dells, Tomah, La Crosse, Red Wing, the Twin Cities, and Winona. Again, let's convert this to a similar corridor where folks can conduct business, safely travel to and fro, and really drive economic activity into the hearts of these communities. Again, graph there showing Hiawatha performance prior to the pandemic. I remind them that the more you capitalize service, the less that you have to subsidize. As the ridership increases, the operating support declines, and as you can see there on the right, Hiawatha financial results have been, we almost achieved an operating ratio of 1. So in transit world, that is, we think, fantastic. And again, an example of how if you invest in the service, the ridership will respond. I talk about I remind them that, again, the Wisconsin-Illinois partnership has been a successful one in terms of going after federal grants. You can see there a timeline of some of the grants and some of the projects that the states of Illinois and Wisconsin have received to invest in and improve the Hiawatha service. Again, we think that the federal government has shown that they are willing to invest in the corridor all the way up to the Twin Cities by the grants that the states of Wisconsin and Minnesota have been successful in receiving. I again remind them of some of the details of what we're looking at. Again, extension of one Hiawatha service, that adding additional frequencies makes the train more convenient, driving ridership. There are those who've calculated a $25 million annual impact to the communities along the route from the additional use of hotels and restaurants, as well as the construction, and that rural communities would gain as well as urban communities, increasing their access, their ability to retain business and talent. I lay out the successful grant application that the states of Minnesota and Wisconsin have benefited from. TCMC is ready to go. It was the recipient last fall of a $31.8 million federal rail improvement grant. In addition to last spring, they received a restoration and enhancement grant of $12 million to defray the operating subsidy that would be required for the first 3 years. And I remind them that in the state of Minnesota, that $53 million project to start TCMC is really $40 million in track work in the state of Minnesota. So what we're asking of the state of Minnesota is a $10 million investment using their annual capital bonding program that would match $6.7 million from the state of Minnesota, $5 million from Amtrak, and again, we're seeking $10 million from the state of Minnesota, and then we could be off to the races to get this project up and running. And at that, I will leave it up to questions or however you want to handle it, Eric. I know there were some other questions on some other routes, and my colleague Dick, who's on with me, can help me out with some of those questions.
Well, that sounds great. Thank you very much, Derrick, for that. I think that gives us a really good overview, and it's sort of a good place to start from. for our discussion here today. So I'm going to kind of start out with sort of a couple of observations and then maybe some questions, and then I'll hand it over to Frank to do the same, and then I know Crystal will open up the chat box so folks are able to start to put some questions in, and we can try to read some of those. I think generally I very much agree with one of the things you said about the need to increase frequency and the disproportionate impact that increased frequency has on ridership. Generally, we see that across the world, that's actually a more predictive metric of increased ridership and more important than travel time, for example. Just knowing that you have more options if you go someplace for business, for work, you have a means of getting back if you miss a particular train, for example. I guess another thing that sort of interests me here is, trying to understand a little bit about what the ridership patterns look like in this corridor. So not only now, but with that additional service, are we going to see more people sort of taking end-to-end trips between Chicago and Minneapolis? Do we see more intermediate trips? I know that was always kind of an interesting discussion point for the long distance routes, in that selling it, I guess, to states in between, is that you tend to see more intermediate trips than you do see end-to-end trips. And so I'm wondering, Derrick, maybe this is a two-part question. Do you have a sense of what that would be for this corridor, first of all, in terms of end-to-end versus intermediate trips? It's the first part of the question. And then the second part of the question is, how do you determine sort of the funding obligation for each of the three states? That what that burden will be between Wisconsin, Illinois, and Minnesota.
Sure. This particular corridor, as you have alluded to, we presently serve this corridor right now. Again, I indicated Chicago-Milwaukee with some frequent corridor-style services. But then north of Milwaukee up to the Twin Cities, we have our long-distance train that originates and ends in Seattle and Portland that actually is the service on the corridor. What we find is the average Amtrak passenger on a long-distance train really travels about 600 miles. On this particular corridor, the heaviest portion of the route is between Chicago and the Twin Cities, to the point that during some years, during the peak travel season, we're actually adding and subtracting coaches at the Twin Cities to accommodate the higher volume of travel in this corridor. So we know that there's demand along this particular route. I think right now, pre-pandemic, we were carrying roughly between 125 and 155,000 unique trips just on the Chicago to Twin Cities segment, so people who are getting on and off just on that segment. The expected increase in ridership on the corridor is around 124,000 people. And correct me, Dick, if I'm wrong on this. There's an additional 124,000 people with the additional train. So almost a doubling of the travel activity in the corridor with the second train frequency. Your second question was dividing up the sort of, how do we sort of parse out the commitment that's necessary along the route? And there are those, I think, who are on the call who may be able to correct me and answer this and add some flavor to it. So let them watch for their chat. I think we've got some friends from Minnesota on. It's really a discussion between the states. Normally, like say, for instance, between Illinois and Wisconsin with the Hiawatha service, my understanding is that was kind of a handshake agreement so many years ago, where Illinois decided to do 25% of the operating subsidy and Wisconsin did 75% of the operating support. So it's really about the states kind of discussing, what the percentages of project in their state, what the ridership would be in their state, and really kind of coming to an amicable agreement. And then some of it as well is, what do we think we can get out of our legislature to support our contribution?
Okay, thank you very much for that, Derrick. That's some helpful context.
Yeah, if you'll notice, if you remember on the slide I showed, Wisconsin's chipping in 6.7 million, I think, and we're asking 10 million of Minnesota. Of course, most of the route is in Wisconsin, but most of the track construction work is being done in Minnesota. So that's why you got the Minnesota piece is a little higher, I think, because the host railroad isn't asking really for that much in terms of track construction in Wisconsin.
Got it. Okay, very good. Thank you for that. I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in the chat box. Before we get to the audience questions, I do want to hand the floor over to Frank Dauma from the Humphrey School, who will give us a little bit of insight here from his perspective as well.
Yeah, thank you, Eric, and thank you, Derrick, for that very informative presentation. So I'll give my remarks largely as an observer here in Minnesota in transportation research. I know that we've got several stakeholders in the group here, and I've seen some comments already in the chat, so they can identify themselves and their expertise, or just stay as participants, but if they'd like to further clarify or correct my comments, I would welcome that. I'm not obviously speaking for MnDOT or the state, but with that put out there, I want to just kind of mention that this is not the one and only rail project, passenger rail project in the state of Minnesota. MnDOT did complete both a freight and passenger rail plan in 2010 and updated it in 2015. And it notes several corridors that are in the relatively near term opportunities that would serve not just the Twin Cities and Winona and Red Wing as we see today, but could extend up to Duluth, down to Rochester, and then also cities like St. Cloud, Fargo, and Mankato. One item that I have noted is there has also been discussion of extending the current commuter rail route from Minneapolis to Big Lake all the way out to St. Cloud. And that could be an opportunity to then also extend over to Union Depot in St. Paul from Minneapolis and create another connection such that you could have a trip relatively seamless from the middle of the state all the way to Chicago, not necessarily just what looks to be kind of a southeastern part to benefit from the state. I mention all of those cities because it indicates that there is support for something besides long-distance highway travel throughout the state of Minnesota. But as we talk about these funding numbers, that means that you aren't going to be able to fund all of those corridors identified in the plan at the same time. And so some folks are likely to benefit sooner than others. And Derrick pointed out the really strong numbers pointing to the opportunities for going forward with the second Twin Cities to Chicago train is possibly the first in line. But one thing that all of these corridors do have in common is they follow a path through the Twin Cities. And as has been noted in the comments and as Derrick mentioned, that can be a political hot potato. I first came to Minnesota and started looking at transportation issues in the mid to late 90s. At that time, you could tell there was a transportation division between greater Minnesota and the Twin Cities, but it wasn't necessarily Republican and Democrat in that split. Since then, we have seen that the political parties have also started to line up with that geographic split, and that has made a greater challenge to getting the legislature on board to recognize that a transportation investment in one particular rail corridor like this is something that could provide benefits beyond just the particular station served. So I think that's the challenge that we see in Minnesota in public policy is explaining that It's not just kind of a one-off additional investment in Twin Cities infrastructure. It's how do you explain that when you invest like this, it brings a greater and broader benefit that folks can be able to sell back to their constituents who may look at a map and not recognize what that benefit is.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Frank, and for that perspective. And certainly enjoying looking at the various comments coming in here in the feed, as well as many great questions. Since a lot of the questions overlap, I'm going to attempt to combine the ones that are somewhat similar. But let's start with this one, which sort of is somewhere between the topic at hand with the Twin Cities service, but also thinking about new routes and new rail service. A lot of people are asking, what about Madison? We obviously know some of the history there, that we almost had a Hiawatha extension to Madison, which was underway really, and had been killed. So a lot of questions are, is this still in the works? Is there any potential to sort of bring Madison into the fray on service that goes up to the Twin Cities?
Frank, you touched on this a little bit when you talked about the state rail plan. And I mentioned that the federal government every year over the past decade has been providing funding through several different grant programs that states can apply for to expand and enhance their rail system and use Amtrak as the operator, or conceivably they could use another operator as well. So the state of Minnesota has a rail plan. The state of Wisconsin has a rail plan too. And it's really up to the state to sort of set the priority on what they view the transportation picture, what they view the system, what it's going to look like in their particular state. So we at Amtrak are continually doing analysis to look at where we think it makes sense to add passenger rail service, and we'll continue to work with and reach out to the states to work with them to put service in place. But at this time, in the state of Wisconsin, service to Madison is not the priority for the state.
Got it. And we'll get to, there's a couple other questions on other service in the Midwest. We'll get to those in a little bit. Let's handle a few more questions while we're at it on the service along this corridor. Maybe
hey, Eric,
I'll take. Yes, Frank.
Can I jump in?
Please do.
I was reviewing my jottings here, and as you're pulling together the next question, one thing that I had not mentioned is that occurred to me as a question, really, to Derrick, I think, is that currently the long distance service here in the Twin Cities and through Minnesota is just 3 days a week, and I was curious if he could comment on how we would ramp up from 3 days a week to at least 2 trains a day, and what kind of time schedule that might take.
Well, going from 3 days a week to every day, there's a bill that's making its way through the Congress right now. I think it's in the Senate, that has the dollars that we would need, and actually has a requirement that we return the long distance train service to daily. So if that bill passes, then my understanding is we have 90 days which to return all the long distance train service that was daily back to daily. And then of course we've got the pandemic. Our bookings right now are looking really positive. It looks like the American public is really pent up and ready to travel. So we're starting to see that reflect in our bookings for the summer. With regard to 2 days a week, maybe I might let Dick answer that question in terms of the timing for the second train.
So what would be the timeline for ramping up from one train a day to 2 trains a day?
Yeah, okay, well that would be, we would like to see, if everything goes, fairly well, we'd like to see construction start sometime mid to late 2022 if possible. And then, again, that timeline would be, I haven't seen any specific, real tight timelines, but then we would hope to get the train operating hopefully by 2024, if not sooner.
So that means that funding is in place, and then agreements are worked out with the host railroads, and final design is completed for the construction projects that are needed on the host railroads right of way.
Very good. Yeah, that's very helpful, and I would certainly love to see that happen. I want to touch on a couple of questions about funding here. Let's start with this one, because you kind of mentioned, you alluded to the current administration and some bills going through Congress, and obviously there's a lot of talk about a Biden infrastructure bill. So one of the questions is, what is the extent to which Amtrak is working with the administration, with the Congress, to try to increase funding? And then I guess obviously specifically in our context, specifically for Midwest rail services like the one we're talking about here.
We're working very closely with the the committees on Capitol Hill and also with the administration. We actually have a vision that you will probably be hearing more about within the next month or so, about what our vision is for where the passenger rail system should go, how we should grow, how we should expand in the U.S. And it does include healthy expansion within the Midwest with hubs at Chicago and St. Louis and Detroit and the Twin Cities.
Got it. Another question also on the funding side of things, you mentioned the necessity to get $10 million for the capital improvements from the state of Minnesota. And somebody was wondering if that $10 million doesn't come through from the state, will that kill the project in its entirety, or will it just sort of change the nature of the project, or make it perhaps not fulfill some of the other metrics you're trying to achieve for this project?
That's a good question. I think one of the discussion points that had been out there is what if the train just goes to La Crosse? The Twin Cities is a vibrant global metropolitan area that the ridership from that to and from that region is really critical to make the service a success. We think that, I guess I don't know the answer. If we don't get the $10 million, does that kill the project? I think that's a discussion that needs to be had with the various parties. We would hope that cooler heads would prevail and we would be able to get those funds. I mean, the governor's office in the state of Minnesota is fully behind this project. We think that the public support is there. We look to organizations like yours to sort of amplify our voice and get the public on board to let their legislative leaders know how important this is. So that's what I can say about that.
As for that $10 million in funding, one of our guests today has, even suggested that it's, in the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge amount of money. Perhaps there's even private sector interests that could get involved, or other organizations. And if my math is correct, I'd like to point out we have 100 people on the call here today. That's only $100,000 per person if we all pony up. If you want to start a GoFundMe right now, Derrick.
Well, I will tell you just a couple of thoughts on that. Yes, I think the inability to get the $10 million in the capital bill that the state of Minnesota passed last fall, out of what was the value of that bill? It was like $1.9 billion. If $10 million, if we could secure $10 million for a project that would result in $40 million of construction, that tells you that the opposition is based on other things. And he touched upon what we're seeing across the country, a schism between a geographic schism in the country and what the priorities should be. So how do we get beyond that? Whether or not the private sector wants to chip in, I mean, it's a value question for them. What do they get for their $10 million? I mean, do we have bake sales? I can remember back when I was a college student in Iowa and active with the Iowa Association of Railroad Passengers. There was an effort to start what we call state-supported passenger rail service between Chicago and Omaha via Cedar Rapids. And I think the Iowa Association of Railroad Passengers, I think chipped in $1,000 toward into the state's fund to help cover that cost. And I don't think the state never contributed any funds to it. So, I mean, I don't have $100,000, but I'm certainly willing to chip in some.
Very good. Very good. Well, maybe it'll be like a snowball rolling down a hill. You start the seed money there, Derrick, and we'll generate a little revenue in this call, can't we? No, the question is just in terms of, from a process perspective, the building up a strong interstate partnership for rail, is that perhaps more important or less important than the TCMC itself from a long-term perspective?
You know, I don't think I can choose between those two. I think both of those are very important. First of all, there is an interstate compact that exists between the Midwestern states, which Minnesota is a part of. It's through the Council of State Governments. It's called the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission. Minnesota has always consistently been an avid supporter of that and been at the table in terms of putting forward a vision for what a Midwestern passenger rail system could look like. I think having a better relationship with the legislative leaders and the folks who are making the decisions, I think would really help. That's why I really can't wait until this pandemic has subsided, because I really think it's getting into the face and getting to meet folks one-on-one is really one of the most effective ways to sort of build a level of trust and a level of rapport. If the state dollars, frankly, are going to be invested. I mean, I think they have an important role to play, these legislators, with their taxpayer dollars, and I don't take lightly asking them to commit some of those dollars to this project. And to the extent that all of you can build relationships with your legislators, I think that helps. It goes beyond just letters, but it visit them at their offices, engage with your neighbors, with businesses in your community to sort of talk this up. We need help. Amtrak doesn't have deep pockets to spread money around the Capitol in St. Paul like some other organizations do.
Someone did ask a question about new equipment and whether that would be included in this service, and that might be a way to then expand to how that could be used elsewhere in the Midwest.
Dick, did you want to touch on that one?
Sure. The Siemens cars, as Derrick had put on the first slide here, those are state-owned cars, so that determine what, and I don't believe Michigan has participated in the procurement of those cars, so that would be something that would have to be discussed. Right now, the cars would be low-level cars from basically the Amtrak's low-level fleet. And, this again is something that's a little early and will probably become, as the project progresses, will become more of a topic of discussion. But the Siemens cars they're ever evolving right now, so.
Do we know, Dick, even if those won't go on the service up to the Twin Cities, do we know when we will see them somewhere in revenue service?
Yes, I'm hoping to see them hopefully late this spring, if not early summer. They're in testing phase right now, and it's my understanding everything's going along pretty smoothly. So with the weather coming back on here, I think we're going to get them here, like I'd like to say by, let's just say late spring.
Okay.
They're here. There's cars here in Chicago under testing, and we're teaching mechanical people how to learn about the cars so they can repair them and maintain them.
Dick, I think you meant Minnesota didn't participate, not Michigan, right?
Oh, did I say Michigan? I'm sorry. Yeah, Minnesota.
Okay.
Couple questions on the Hiawatha service. I don't know if you could, Dick, maybe give a quick update on the increased service there, and sort of a corollary to that question is someone asked if it's possible, if Amtrak would ever consider perhaps buying that corridor and making it a dedicated passenger rail corridor.
Yeah, that would be a great thing with a real GoFundMe effort on that one. Dedicated rail is what it is. It's expensive, and I don't know that we could buy that property. That's kind of a pretty big speculation. But that project is also moving forward, and there's some further analysis being done to try to determine the infrastructure improvements that would allow for us to add additional trains between Chicago and Milwaukee.
Got it. Got it. And while we're on the topic of other services here in the Midwest, somebody also asked about the status of the planned service, which got a little boost from the Illinois Capital Bill, the planned service out to Rockford and eventually to Dubuque.
Yeah, the Chicago Moline train. Again, the money there. It's in the hands of Illinois DOT right now, and they're doing the communication and negotiating with the host railroad. And again, that's something that we sure hope we'll get some kind of agreement together by the end of this year, and then we can move forward with that quickly. Rockford is, of course, a little further behind, but now that it does have its funding, there is a project manager on the job. We don't have a lot of detail on how that's progressing right now. Again, it's an Illinois DOT led effort at this point, and some point once it gets closer, we'll be brought more into it. But with the pandemic, of course, I'm sure that's slowed their process a little bit. But it's my understanding that both projects are still on a go. Got it.
And then another corridor here, the Chicago-St. Louis corridor. Any sense on when we might see higher speeds on that corridor, and will we ever see the speeds at the promised 110 miles per hour?
Well, sure hope so. Right now, testing should be wrapping up shortly at a 90 mile per hour level. And again, that's something we hope to see this summer go to 90 for the entire corridor.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Frank, did you pick out any more questions on any of those corridors or on the Twin Cities service that you wanted to ask our participants today? Because we'll probably have time for maybe about two more questions.
Well, to follow on that question about increasing speeds, I think I saw a couple of questions asking about what would be the operating speeds of the Twin Cities corridor, and if there'd be opportunities for that to be increased to higher speed or high speed rail at any point.
Yeah, currently it would have to stay at the standard speeds that we operate at 79 miles an hour. But, as far as increasing, that would be something that would have to be addressed once we've established the service. And again, that's kind of far, that's a pretty involved effort.
Eric and Frank, a debate that goes on, mostly in circles outside of Amtrak is sort of the value of speed. But I think Eric, you touched on, we've seen pretty good success simply by increasing frequencies and by incremental improvements that improve the competitiveness of the train versus the car. Sure, for years I've heard folks lament that they want trains like we have in Europe, but we have to we leave it to organizations on the outside to make that case. Here and now, we have to deal within the realm of the possible. And where we have seen growth and where we have seen success is in incremental improvements and adding frequencies on the existing network. And that's building, I think, a level of credibility to allow funding to continue to come forward to make those improvements. And maybe we will see some true high-speed rail service at some point. We hope that happens. We think it's good for the country. But right now, Dick and I have a job to do today, and that's to get more trains out there. I saw there was another question someone was asking, going back to the acquiring of the railroad between Chicago and Milwaukee. Interesting financially, that particular corridor is probably the best corridor in the entire country in terms of on-time performance, even better than the Acela. And we have a pretty good working relationship with the host railroad, who uses that railroad for their freight business. They pay the taxes on it. So in essence, it's a real win-win for us because we're sharing the cost of that corridor. Anytime, it's great when we have a passenger-only corridor, but then all of the costs are borne by the passenger operator. So having a shared use corridor from a financial perspective has its benefits.
Thanks,
the
Derrick.
railroad has shown an ability. Yeah, the railroad has shown an ability to run those trains very well. When you think about all the metro trains, all the freight trains, and all the Amtrak trains, and that route runs at better than 95%. It proves that the railroads can do it.
That's fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much, Derrick. That's some really great context on that question. I think we're at about time here, and I want to respect